Welcome to the deep dive. Ever felt, just overwhelmed, so much information, so much chaos, trying to figure out what actually matters?
Absolutely. It feels like trying to find your footing on shifting sand sometimes, doesn't it?
Exactly. How do you even navigate all that without just, losing your way?
It's a huge question.
Well, today we're doing a deep dive into a really extraordinary text, and I should warn you, it's pretty radical stuff. We're looking at excerpts from Julius Evola's Ride the Tiger, Survival Manual for the Aristocrats of the Soul.
Yeah, radical is definitely the word. Evola pulls no punches. He gives this incredibly harsh critique of the modern world. He doesn't just see it as declining. He calls it a state of dissolution, basically ruins.
And he contrasts that so sharply with what he calls the world of tradition, something constant, unchanging, essentially.
And look, his ideas are challenging, no doubt about it, but they offer this really unique lens, I think, for trying to understand some deep currents shaping our reality right now.
So our mission today is to unpack that. First, his diagnosis, why he sees the world in dissolution, and then, maybe more surprisingly, the path he lays out.
Right, the path for what he calls a differentiated human type. Someone who, against all odds, tries to stay on their feet among the ruins. It's quite a concept.
Okay, let's unpack this. So, Evola's core premise, it's stark, isn't it? He sees the modern world as the exact antithesis of traditional civilization.
Completely opposite. And he's pretty pessimistic about changing it back. He thinks any attempt to revert using traditional values is increasingly unlikely.
Why? What's missing?
He basically says there's no starting point left, not for nations, not really for individuals either, given the dominant ideas and energies of our time. It's like the foundation's gone. A void, almost, as you said earlier.
Wow. And what's fascinating here, as you mentioned, is how he traces this break, this European nihilism, he calls it.
Yeah, and for him, it starts with something deep, a fracture of an ontological character. Fancy words, but what he means is human life has lost its why, its connection to anything beyond the immediate, the material. Transcendence, basically.
And this stems from the death of God.
That's his root cause, yeah. Losing that transcendent reference point isn't just a philosophical issue for Evola. It's like the fundamental weakness, the rot that makes everything else eventually crumble from the inside. Morality, society, the whole structure.
So if that ultimate why is gone, what happens to something like morality? How does someone actually live day to day with what he calls that empty command?
Exactly the question. Evola argues that when morality gets cut off from, theology, metaphysics, when it's based only on reason, like Kantian ethics tried to do.
Duty for duty's sake.
Right. It loses its invulnerable foundation. It just becomes this empty and rigid command. And eventually, because there's no why behind it, it just collapses. It feels meaningless. Like that house without a foundation you mentioned. It just can't stand.
And you can kind of see this playing out, in his view, through history, in culture.
Oh, definitely. He points to literary and social movements, like the Romantic heroes, like Rimbaud, Lautréamont, these figures driven by this existential angst, this trauma.
Their rebellion was sort of irrational against everything.
Yeah, an irrational rebellion, he called it. And then fast forward post-World War II, he looks at the rebels without a cause, the Beat Generation, the hipsters.
Kerouac, Ginsberg, that whole scene.
Exactly. He sees them embodying this deeper nihilism, a kind of destructive, voteless rage, a contempt for anything square, anything conventional or seemingly meaningful.
I remember that quote you mentioned from Podhoretz about their disdain for normal life.
Yeah, disdain for anyone seriously involved with a woman, a job, a cause. They felt, as Evola puts it, born among the ruins. Just this overwhelming sense of absurdity, the pure irrationality of the human condition.
There's that Kerouac character saying, work, read, believe, then have your back broken, no thanks.
Precisely. A total rejection. That's not for me. It's like, why bother trying to build anything on ruins?
Okay, so that's the diagnosis. Pretty bleak. Now, let's shift to how he sees modern society trying to cope, or maybe ignore, this void, the socioeconomic myths.
Right. He looks at Western prosperity on one hand and Marxist communist ideology on the other and sees them both as, basically anesthetics.
Painkillers. Masking the void.
Yeah, internal anesthetization or prophylaxis is his phrase. They distract from that deeper spiritual emptiness by focusing us elsewhere. He calls the result the animal ideal.
The animal ideal, what does that mean?
It's a life focused purely on biological well-being. Comfort, optimism, euphoria, satisfying basic hunger and sex drive. just keeping the organism happy, basically.
And the downside?
The atrophy, he says, of every superior form of sensibility and interest. Life gets reduced to the lowest common denominator. Higher aspirations just wither.
It's quite a critique. So if societies just aim for material comfort, something vital gets lost.
That's his argument. He even brings in Hegel's observation, that epochs of material well-being are blank pages in the history book.
Meaning nothing truly significant happens.
Sort of. And then there's that statistic he mentions about suicide rates, how it's statistically proven to be much rarer in poor countries than in rich ones.
Wow. What's the implication there?
For Evola, it points to a kind of spiritual poverty that can hide behind material wealth. So what is that? Maybe all that focus on getting comfortable comes at the cost of real meaning, real connection.
Okay, so if that's the bleak picture, the world in dissolution, what's Evola's alternative? This is where riding the tiger comes in.
Right, exactly. It's the core concept. Instead of fighting these forces head on, which he sees as futile.
You can't stop the tsunami.
Right, so the differentiated man doesn't try to stop it. He actively accepts it.
Yeah.
But the goal is to somehow transform the negative energy into something positive, or at least not be destroyed by it. By letting the forces and processes of this epoch take their own course, but critically, while keeping in view the conditions that may come about in the future. It's like surfing that tsunami, as you said. You have to ride the wave, stay balanced, look ahead. Incredible detachment needed.
And what's the anchor in all this chaos?
What's fascinating here is that the only constant for Evola is being oneself. That's what's left after the elimination of every bond, every external support.
Like Nietzsche's become what you are.
Exactly. He echoes that. Be yourself. But, and this is crucial.
It's not easy.
Not at all. It's not some simple self-help slogan. Evola stresses the huge challenge. True being oneself means overcoming your own internal divisions. He uses Dostoevsky's characters, like Raskolnikov or Stavrogin.
Who are torn apart internally.
Right. Their freedom, their being themselves, it actually turned against them and destroys them because they were divided beings. Remorse, for Evola, is a symptom of that inner split. It shows you're not unified.
So real strength comes from somewhere else.
Yes. From a principle superior to life itself. He uses this powerful phrase, spirit is the life that cuts through life. It's about tapping into something transcendent within.
And this leads to active anonymity? What's that?
It means acting not from your ego, your personal desires, but from this super-individual principle, the self, transcendence, whatever you call it. Your actions become guided by something higher, more impersonal. He connects it to traditional anonymous heroes who acted for a principle, not for fame or gain.
Here's where it gets really interesting. This idea of invulnerability, acting from an unconditioned nucleus, a calm, detached principle, that sounds almost inhuman. How do you even cultivate that in the real world?
It's a very high bar, certainly. But this detachment, this inner calm, is what leads to action without desire. Maybe even action without acting.
Meaning?
Performing tasks, doing what needs to be done, but impersonally, without being emotionally swayed by whether it brings pleasure or pain, whether people approve or disapprove.
Like that martial artist example you gave. Fully engaged, but mentally detached.
Exactly like that. Kind of flow state, but grounded in this deep inner stillness. And this raises an important question, doesn't it? What about consequences?
Right. Does this detachment mean you don't care about results?
Not quite. Evola connected to the traditional idea of karma, not in the sense of moral reward or punishment, but as natural cause and effect. Actions have consequences, sure, but they're neutral, objective facts, not things to get emotionally invested in or judged by. It's about understanding the mechanics without the emotional baggage.
Okay, so with this kind of radical inner posture, how does this differentiated man actually deal with the world? Let's take science. Evola's critique sounds pretty harsh, just hypotheses and formulae for control.
It is harsh. He argues modern science doesn't give us true knowledge, just models for prediction and manipulation. You might look at medical advances, for instance, and say, yes, useful for the body, but does it tell you anything fundamental about existence itself? Probably not, in his view.
So even something like Einstein's relativity?
He'd say it offers purely formal certainties. Mathematical consistency, maybe, but not intrinsic truth about reality. Modern physics, especially quantum mechanics with all its abstraction, he sees it as a falsification of the elevation of the mind.
How so?
It produces reality to shadows reduced to their common denominator. It makes the world abstract, mathematical, losing its concrete, spiritual substance. And his conclusion is pretty striking. Henceforth, man only meets himself. Science becomes a mirror of our own limited ways of thinking, not a window onto ultimate reality.
That's a stark view. Okay, what about nature? Is that the antidote? A return to the wild?
Not for Evola, no. He actually sees the simple return to nature idea as regressive. Part of that animal ideal we talked about, just focusing on the biological, the primitive.
So what's the right relationship?
For the differentiated man, it's about feeling equally at home or perhaps equally detached in both the city and in nature, maintaining distance from both, finding a kind of school of objectivity and distance in truly wild, primordial, and inaccessible places.
Like deserts, glaciers, the deep ocean.
Exactly. Places that aren't cozy or nurturing, but vast, impersonal, implacable. They teach detachment, perspective. It's not about finding solace in nature, but finding objectivity through it.
And the sense of dissolution, it permeates art and music, too, for him.
Absolutely. He sees modern art splitting, either becomes hyper-intimate, retreating inward, he mentions Joyce, Proust, or it becomes this kind of self-consuming revolt.
And things like Marxist realism.
A simian parody, he calls it. Just imitation, lacking any real spirit. Ultimately, for this differentiated type, art becomes of little interest. Why? Because it's lost its connection to higher spiritual truth. It's just decoration, a luxury item for idle parasites. Harsh, again.
Very harsh. And music, is it the same story?
Pretty much. He sees a trajectory from, say, super-intellectualized abstract constructions, think early Stravinsky 12-tone music.
Very formal, mathematical almost.
Right, to the other extreme. The raw, physical character of jazz, which he describes as mechanical, disjointed, altogether primitively ecstatic, kind of a regression to the primal, the rhythmic.
But didn't you say he saw some potential value there?
Yes, oddly enough. He suggests that for the differentiated man, even these trends, the abstract or the primal, could offer a kind of stimulus, a particular intoxication, he calls it, but only if approached from that higher state of being, that detached perspective. It's not about enjoying it conventionally, but maybe extracting some insight about the age, or even using the rhythm to fuel a certain inner state. Very unconventional view.
Definitely. Okay, let's move to the social realm. Politics, the state. How does this apolitia work?
Well, first, he dismisses modern states, calls them just representative and administrative systems. They lack true, inalienable authority in his eyes.
And leaders.
Mere figureheads or maybe celebrities, not embodying any real principle. So, faced with this, the differentiated man adopts apolitia, which means
Inner distance.
detachment. Exactly, like tuning out a radio station playing static. He just doesn't find any ideas, motives, and goals worthy of the pledge of one's own true being. It's all seen as superficial, ultimately meaningless from his transcendent standpoint.
So even choosing between big ideologies like capitalism versus communism.
For him, that's just a banal practical choice, like choosing which bus to take. It doesn't touch the fundamental questions of existence.
Now, this idea of apolitia, withdrawing, doesn't that seem irresponsible to some? Doesn't it leave the field open to the very forces he dislikes?
That's a common reaction.
Yeah.
But Evola wouldn't see it that way. His focus isn't on fixing the external world. He thinks that's largely impossible anyway in this age. The focus is entirely on internal transformation, maintaining one's own spiritual integrity amidst the ruins. Civic duty in the conventional sense just isn't part of his framework here.
And this detachment extends beyond politics to society itself.
Yes. He sees all the traditional organic units, caste, stock, nation, homeland, even the family, was having dissolved, broken down into just a shifting mass of individuals.
So concepts like nation or homeland are just myths now.
Political myths, he calls them, born from the destruction of older, more organic traditional ties. But interestingly, he sees the current crisis of these concepts, the breakdown of nationalism, as potentially positive.
How so?
A potential liberation, if it leads to a new kind of unity.
Yeah.
One based not on blood or soil, these naturalistic ties, but purely on shared ideas, shared spiritual orientation.
A unity of minds, not just geography or birth.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And this internal focus, the sense of crisis, applies right down to the family. He sees the traditional family structure as fundamentally broken.
In what way?
It's lost its spiritual authority, especially the father's traditional role. Marriage itself has become, in his view, just a petite bourgeois institution, driven by practicalities, utilitarian factors, or just fleeting sentimental feelings, lacking a deeper sacred dimension.
And the sexual revolution. More freedom.
He's critical here, too. He'd say it offers freedom in sex, maybe, but not freedom from sex. It doesn't lead to transcendence, just to widespread. Well, he calls it incipient promiscuity. He's also critical of the traditional Christian hatred for sex, seeing that as another dead end, reducing it to just biology.
So what's the alternative for the differentiated man in this realm?
He sees little value in these common modern forms of relationships or sexuality. He hints at seeking rarer, maybe deeper, more controlled possibilities connected to spiritual practice, if any connection is sought at all. But the default is detachment here, too.
So we've mapped out the world according to Evola and how this differentiated person tries to navigate it. But what about the core spiritual problem and those ultimate existential questions?
Right. He issues a really strong warning here against what he calls second religiosity, all the modern spiritual trends.
Like what?
Neo-spiritualism, pop yoga, occultism, even psychoanalysis to some extent. He views these mostly as illusions, symptoms of decay themselves.
Why illusion?
Because they often focus on the subterranean strata of the human psyche, the subconscious, the psychic not on true transcendence, the genuinely spiritual level above the merely human. He sees them as counterfeits of real traditional doctrines, lacking the depth, the rigor, the connection to a genuine lineage.
So you can't just become initiated by reading a book or joining a weekend workshop.
Absolutely not. In his view, true initiation, which he defines as a fundamental ontological and existential change of man's state, a change in your very being, is extremely rare now. And crucially, it's not something you can achieve just through your own effort. The whole self-made man ideal doesn't apply here. It requires something more, a connection to a surviving traditional current, which he believes is almost impossible to find.
That's quite a barrier. Okay, finally, the ultimate confrontation. Death. And even suicide. How does the differentiated man face death?
With that same core principle, invulnerability. Cultivating such detachment that the anguish of death simply doesn't register. Seeing it as a natural event devoid of emotional impact. Again, a radical stance.
And suicide. Is it ever permissible in this view? This raises an important question.
It does. Evola looks at, for example, Stoic and some Buddhist traditions that did permit suicide, but only for a very specific type, the superior and ascetic type.
Not as an escape from pain.
No, not primarily. More as a sovereign right, the right to exit when life has genuinely lost its higher meaning for that individual, or maybe as a final ultimate demonstration of inner freedom and detachment from the biological imperative to live. It's framed as mastery, not desperation.
And he connects this to an idea about choosing one's existence.
Yes, this rather esoteric idea of an original, prenatal, and pretemporal choice for the life you're living, which implies a kind of responsibility to see that chosen path through, unless perhaps the conditions make fulfilling that path truly impossible, or the path itself reaches its conclusion. Then, a detached exit might be seen as consistent with that original choice. It's complex and frankly quite challenging territory.
Wow. Okay. We have journeyed really deep into Julius Evola's perspective today. It's certainly unflinching. His diagnosis of the modern world is this period of profound dissolution.
Yeah, and then this unique path he outlines for the differentiated man. Not fighting, not escaping, but this active acceptance, this inner detachment, self-mastery, trying to re-anchor in something transcendent while everything else seems to be falling apart.
It's definitely a challenging lens, as you said, but it does offer, I think, a powerful way to maybe re-examine our own relationship with the world around us, doesn't it?
I think so. It really pushes you to think about what you hold on to, what you value, what actually constitutes a meaningful life when so many of the usual external markers are, well, dissolving, from his point of view at least.
So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. In a world where so much feels like it's dissolving, where traditions are questioned, where old anchors seem to be vanishing, how can you start to discern what's essential from what's just transient? And maybe even more fundamentally, what does it actually mean for you to define your own sense of meaning and purpose, independent of what society or the latest trend tells you?